Hi again, everyone. Gabe here. Welcome to part 2 of the Frame Academy project, creating a WebVR site with basic HTML. So to kick this off, I'm going to show you how I did the challenge from part 1, which, as you might remember, was bringing a few shapes into your project on Glitch. So hopping over to my Glitch project now so that you can see how I've set it up. And notice that I've actually embedded the project right into the website so that you can take a look at it. You've got the code on the left and you've got the site itself on the right. And by the way, you've been working on your own project, but if you ever just want to kind of start from scratch, or if you want to kind of pick up from where my code leaves off, you can always click this Remix to Edit button on one of my code samples, and that'll just make a quick copy of that for you so that you can then build on top of that or edit it or do whatever you want with it. Okay, so in my scene, inside of my scene element, I now have my box. I've got a dodecahedron element and I've got a sphere element. All of them have the opening and the closing tag, and each of them has some attributes. So remember, attributes go inside of the opening tag of an element, and they let you modify an element's appearance or behavior. So I've got a box with this position 0, 0, -4. I've given it a color of blue, and so on, so on. And what this looks like, let's take a peek, is all right. I've got a few shapes sort of lined up there. There's my blue box, there's my red sphere, there's my yellow dodecahedron. Okay, now for us to really liven this up, because as you might have noticed, these are all right in front of us, we're going to have to experiment a bit more with position. Now, we went over position a little bit in part 1, but we're going to just dive in a bit more here. So, as you might recall, the reason why these the position attribute takes 3 numbers, 0, 0, -4, is because we're working in 3D space, and each of these numbers represents a direction or an axis. Okay. So this first number represents the x-axis, the horizontal axis, left or right. So because this value is 0, it's just right in the center of the scene. That's why my blue box is right in the middle. The middle number, 0, this is the vertical axis, the y-axis. And because it's 0, it's, again, it's not up top and it's not below. It's kind of right at the sort of floor of the scene. Okay. And then finally, we've got the third number, which is the special z-axis, kind of represents depth, forward or backward. And the camera in these scenes by default is situated so that it's pointed in the negative direction. That's why -4 as the value for the z-axis will place an object right in front of us or in view of the camera. So I've got -4 for the box, I've got -8 for the dodecahedron, that's why it's behind the box, it's even farther away. And then I've got -10 for the sphere. Okay. But let's see what happens when we adjust some of these values, right? Let's say that I want my box to be a little bit to the right. I'm going to give it a value of 2. Let's see how that changes things. Okay, there we go. So my box just shifted a bit, 2. Now if I were to give it -2, see, now it goes to the left. Okay. So to help orient you, the camera, which is sort of our viewpoint, is actually set at 0, 0, 0. It's the origin point. Okay. So that's kind of the point of reference for you. If something has a negative x value, it's going to be going to the left. But if it's positive, it'll go to the right. Let's go ahead and make this 2 again, but this time change the y value from 0 to 2. Okay, here we go. See how it moved up in space, right, vertically? Let's make it move up even more. Let's go 4. All right, there it is. So you're getting a sense of how position works. All right, now let's try adjusting the z value. Right now it is -4, which places it in front of the camera. But let's say you wanted it behind the camera on the other side of the scene. Let's go ahead and make it 4. Okay. Now it's dropped out of the initial view, but that's because the object is no longer right in front of the camera initially. But if you turn the camera around, you'll see our cube is indeed right there. Okay. Okay, so now that our scene is starting to get just a bit more complex, we've got stuff in front of the camera and behind it, it's worth pausing for a second and just going over how to actually view and navigate your scene on a few different devices. So on desktop, as you might have noticed, I can simply click and drag, which rotates my camera and my viewer around the scene. But you can also move around the scene on desktop using some keyboard controls. So if you press A, you'll actually move yourself, kind of the camera, to the left. If you press D, you'll move it to the right. If you press W, you'll move it forward. And if you press S, you'll move backwards. Okay. So I've listed these out also on the text for this part of the project, so don't worry about remembering it. But I think you'll find that once you get used to it, it's a pretty simple navigation system. You can also customize this as you want down the line, but this is what comes out of the box with AFrame, which is that development framework you brought into your project in part 1. Now on mobile devices, it's a little bit different. So I brought in, if you can see this, I loaded up the project on mobile, and you'll see that you can tap and drag to rotate the camera around the scene, or you can also just simply tilt your device around, and that also moves the camera. So there you go, very easy. Now, if you have a mobile VR headset like a Gear VR or a Cardboard, you can tap this button on the bottom right corner. That's the VR button, and that will render your website in VR mode. And then you can simply just slide it into your Cardboard and view it there. When you're in VR, moving the camera around is just looking around, right? You're there, you're immersed, you just look around your scene. And to walk around, you simply walk. Now, to walk, though, you need a device with positional tracking, a desktop-based VR device, or the upcoming Oculus Quest, or when the Quest is out, when this course is live, the Oculus Quest. So to view your website on like a standalone VR headset, you can do it a few ways. So if it's a desktop system, if you open the site on PC and you have your Oculus Rift or your Vive plugged in, you can click the VR button on the bottom right and it will render your site in your headset. I do recommend the Firefox browser for this because it has the best WebVR support. But let me know if you run into any issues trying to view your site in VR. It's usually pretty easy though. If you're using a standalone headset like the Oculus Go, which I think I have down here, like this cute thing, you simply need to open up the Oculus browser app, which is an app built into the Go. Okay? And then when you're there, you navigate to the URL of your website, just as if you were navigating to any other website. When you go there, you'll see that VR button, and you can click it with your the laser pointer on your controller, and that will render your site in immersive mode. Okay, so now that our scene is getting a bit more complex, and we've got some stuff in front of the camera, some stuff behind it, I want to show you sort of an easier way to position the elements in your scene. Right? It can be really annoying and tedious to always be sort of adjusting the values in your code and then refreshing your site to see if you've gotten it right, when that can be tricky sometimes. So this is kind of a really cool tool that's built into your website already. It kind of comes with AFrame, called the AFrame Inspector. So if you have your project open in a browser on desktop, you can press Control, hold down Control, Alt-I. That'll pull up this inspector window. And I'll break this down for you. Front and center, you've just got the scene view, which you're used to. You've seen it before. It's just kind of the look at your scene. But on the left, you've actually got a list of all of the elements or entities in your scene. So you can see your box, your dodecahedron, and your sphere. And you can select them right here. You'll also see a few other entities, and these are sort of default entities that just come with your scene automatically. You can remove these if you want or change them, and we'll get into them a bit more later, but you don't need to worry about them for now. Just don't worry. Now, you can also select the different elements just by clicking on them in the scene. Now, on the right, you've actually got all of the properties or kind of the attributes for what you have selected. So, right, I've selected my sphere here, and you can see its position and rotation and scale are listed right there. There are also a whole lot of other things, geometry and these material properties, that we'll get to some of them down the line, but you don't need to worry about right now. If you'd like to experiment with some and kind of tinker with these values, you'll actually see the change reflected right in your scene as you change these. So it's a nice way to kind of experiment. I can't say that I even understand all of these, just so you know, but don't be intimidated by all these fancy looking words. They often mean something pretty simple. In any case, though, what I really want to show you is how when you have something selected, like this sphere, you can actually move it right here in the inspector just by dragging it with these 3 arrows coming out of it. So we've got the 1 arrow for the x-axis, right, moving it to the right or the left. You've got an arrow for the y-axis, moving it up or down. You've got one for the z-axis to move it forward or backward. And as you change it like this, you'll see the position value actually changing here in the inspector. So you could say, oh, you're trying to place this sphere. I really want it up here. You can say that looks great. So do that, move it in inspector, and then just simply copy those values into your code. In other words, inspector, making the changes to your scene here, that's great. It'll make the change, but it's not a permanent change. To make that change permanent, you do want to copy those values back into your code. That way, when you refresh your site, those changes that you want will be reflected. Okay? Now, the movement widget is the one selected by default, but you can see you can adjust a few other things using other widgets. So if you look up to this little toolbar, you've got one for rotation as well. You can click that, and that pulls up a similar thing, but this time when you're changing it, it'll change the rotation of the object. I had it on the sphere before, but rotating it doesn't look like much because it's a sphere. So I'm moving over to my dodecahedron. You can see I'm spinning it around however I want, and as I do it, that's changing the rotation value over here. You can also do scale. So if you click on the scale widget, that'll give you a way to change its scale, and scale means size. And you can change something's size on the x-axis, which will make it bigger horizontally, or the y-axis, which will make it bigger vertically, or if you want to scale it proportionally, which means it kind of grows bigger in the same way in all the same directions, just grab it and move it right from the middle, right? See how that kind of scales it up or down sort of equally in every direction. Okay, again, remember, once you make those changes, check out the values over here and make sure you copy them back so that they're reflected in your code. To navigate the scene view here in the middle, you can do it a few ways. Just as when your website is live, you can click and drag to rotate the camera, but you can do a few other things too. So you can use the scroll wheel. Right now I'm scrolling out to kind of zoom the camera out. Now I'm scrolling in to zoom in. And you can also use the right mouse button to pan the camera. This moves it left or right, or up or down. So it takes a little getting used to. If you're kind of working with 3D space for the first time, this will be a little strange, but once you get the hang of it, you'll be kind of zipping around your scene in no time. So this gives you a good way to kind of get like a bird's eye view of your scene. You can zoom the camera out, you can rotate it all around, and then of course you can pan your camera. Okay, once you've made a few changes in Inspector, you can also press back to scene to see those changes and how they would look in your actual scene. You can always click this to go back to Inspector. Okay, now that you have some basic familiarity with that tool, let's go ahead and check out the challenge for this part. So the challenge is using the Inspector. Go ahead and change the position, rotation, and scale of some of the shapes in your scene. Okay? And then once you've changed those values, go ahead and copy those values into your code, okay, to make those changes permanent. Now, position, rotation, and scale, all of these attributes, they look pretty similar, right? They'll each take 3 values, each value representing one of the axes, right? The first one for X, right to left, the second one for Y, up or down, and the third one for Z, forward or backwards. So that's why they all look sort of similar. They're all formatted the same way, right, with 3 numbers. Okay, finally, once you've made those changes in your code, make sure you reload your site and make sure that those changes are permanent and that they're working okay. If you run into any issues, ask a question in our online community. And I encourage you to tinker around in the inspector, to mess around with any of those other properties to see if you can see how that's affecting your scene. Okay, I will see you in part 3.